What if the history we've been taught is just the final chapter of a much older book? What if long before the first recorded empire, rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years? And what if those rulers weren't entirely human? Welcome, wanderers of the forgotten past, to Whispered Empires, where ancient stones speak and myths breathe again. Tonight, we journey into one of the most enigmatic artifacts ever unearthed, the Sumerian King List. A text that calmly declares kings ruled for 241,200 years, before the Great Flood swept the world. Were these figures mythical, misunderstood, or evidence of something far more extraordinary, a legacy left by the Anunnaki, the so-called gods from the sky? If stories like this help you escape into the mystery of ancient worlds, feel free to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Tonight, let us begin not with a loud declaration, but with a whisper. A whisper from beneath the sands of Mesopotamia. A whisper that dares to question everything we believe about time, kingship, and the origins of civilization. The wind that day was hot and dry, the kind of wind that carries not just dust, but time itself. It was in the arid heart of Iraq, near the ancient ruins of Nippur, where an unassuming excavation team brushed away the sand of millennia and uncovered a tablet that would defy the very framework of human history. At first glance, it was just another piece of clay, fractured by centuries of burial. But beneath the grit, the cuneiform script shimmered faintly under the midday sun, like a wound in the timeline waiting to be reopened. The archaeologist who found it wasn't looking for world-shattering revelations. He had expected routine artifacts, broken pottery, temple inscriptions, perhaps a fragment of a royal edict. Instead, his fingers traced lines carved with almost unnerving precision, as if the scribe had not written for his own age, but for eyes thousands of years in the future. The moment the tablet was lifted, a silence rippled through the team. Even the wind seemed to hush. They didn't know it yet, but they were holding the Sumerian King List, a relic that would claim kings had ruled for 241,200 years before the Great Flood. A timeline that would send historians and mystics alike spiraling into debate for decades to come. Transporting the artifact was done with ritual-like care. It was packed not just in padding, but in reverence, as if those who touched it sensed it carried something far heavier than clay. Whispers spread among the dig team. Some said the script seemed too clean, others that it was as though the earth itself had been guarding a secret. And in a way it had. Because hidden beneath layers of time, under sands that had witnessed empires rise and fall, was a story no one was prepared to read. A story older than history itself. And tonight we're about to open it. Long before books lined shelves and archives had digital fingerprints, there was a different kind of library, one built not of paper and ink, but of clay and silence. In the ancient city of Nippur, beneath collapsed walls and forgotten ziggurats, lay what scholars now call a silent library. It wasn't a single structure, but a network, chambers stacked with tablets, meticulously inscribed with wedge-shaped marks by hands that had turned history into a whispering code. It was here, among thousands of fragmented records, that the tablet we now call the Sumerian King List was first stored. Imagine this place in its prime. The air thick with the scent of clay and fire from the kilns where tablets were hardened. Rows upon rows of scribes, young men with sharp eyes and steady hands, pressing styluses into wet clay with unwavering precision. They were not simply writing stories. They were etching power, lineage, law, and the cosmic order itself into permanence. This was a civilization that believed words could shape destiny, and once carved into clay, they could outlive empires. But time is a cruel archivist. Centuries passed, cities fell, and temples turned to dust. The once vibrant library became a mausoleum of knowledge, buried and forgotten. When the archaeologists first stepped inside the remnants of that archive, they felt something uncanny, the kind of silence that doesn't just mean absence of sound, but the presence of something watching. A silence that holds secrets too vast to speak. Each tablet lifted from that library was a key. Some spoke of trade, some of war, some of gods. But one was different. Its script didn't describe mere history. It described epochs, reigns so long they mocked human mortality. It whispered names of kings who ruled not for decades, but for thousands of years. And as scholars carefully cataloged it, they began to realize something unsettling. This wasn't just a royal record, it was a chronicle of the impossible. That silent library had kept its voice sealed for thousands of years. Now it had begun to speak again, and what it had to say would challenge everything. The tablet sat under a controlled light in the translation room, no longer just a relic of dirt and clay, but a riddle carved by hands that no one alive could remember. The team of epigraphers and linguists, specialists in cuneiform script, leaned in with focused silence. Every wedge-shaped stroke was photographed, magnified, and transcribed. At first, it seemed like a familiar royal inscription, lists of names, places, reigns. That was expected. But then the numbers came. The first name, Alulum. Reign, 28,800 years. The second, Alungar. Reign, 36,000 years. And the list went on, names fading into time, but numbers rising like a tide against the boundaries of belief. The lead translator, a seasoned expert, paused mid-sentence. He checked the sign again. Then again. There was no error. The symbols clearly represented SARS, a unit of time in the Sumerian sexagesimal system, where one SAR equaled 3,600 years. What they were reading wasn't mythological poetry. It was an official chronology, carved with administrative precision. A wave of unease swept through the room. Historians are trained to question extraordinary claims, and here was a tablet making the most extraordinary claim of all. That long before the rise of later kingdoms, long before Sumer as we know it, rulers reigned for hundreds of thousands of years. Not generations, not centuries, eras. Some argued it had to be symbolic. Others whispered it might encode astronomical cycles. One younger researcher muttered, not loud enough to be taken seriously, that perhaps it wasn't human history at all. The debate began before the translation was even complete. But beneath the rational objections, something primal stirred. The text didn't read like a myth. It had the cold, administrative precision of a ledger, a record meant to be believed. And so, disbelief became the first response. But curiosity became the second. That moment marked the beginning of a deeper mystery, one that would fracture the boundary between history and legend. Because once a story is read, it can never be unread. And this story had just been spoken aloud for the first time in thousands of years. The ink of disbelief hadn't yet dried when the numbers began to sink in like cold water. On the Sumerian King List, the reigns were not counted in years as we know them, but in SARs, a unit of time from the Sumer's base 60 counting system. One SAR equaled 3,600 years. 10 SARs meant 36,000. And as the team calculated, they watched the timeline balloon into something almost incomprehensible. One king ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. By the end of the pre-flood list, the total years added up to a staggering 241,200 years. For a brief moment, the room seemed to grow smaller, not because of the space, but because the scale of time they were confronting made human history feel microscopic. It's one thing to find a legend that claims a god lived forever. It's another to find an administrative document, carved in ancient clay, recording impossibly long reigns with the same matter-of-fact tone used to list taxes or temple offerings. This was a mythology dressed in poetic metaphor. This was data. Cold, deliberate, numerical data. How could they have conceived of time on this scale? One translator whispered. Why would anyone fabricate such precise numbers? Another replied, half in awe, half in dread, maybe they didn't. That question hung in the air like smoke. If the numbers were symbolic, then what cosmic truth were they trying to describe? If they weren't symbolic, then humanity was staring at a timeline that stretched back long before recorded civilization, long before what we think of as the beginning of history. The King List wasn't just telling a story, it was challenging everything about our understanding of time itself. These weren't just numbers carved into clay. They were numbers that broke the boundaries of reality, a quiet, unwavering claim that kings once ruled for an age when God still walked the earth. When night fell over the excavation camp, the tablet lay under heavy security in a protective case, but its presence was anything but silent. Among the researchers, a strange atmosphere lingered, not fear exactly, but a sense of standing on the edge of something vast and unseen. Every discovery has a voice. Some shout their truths loudly. This one whispered, and those whispers carried the weight of millennia. Around the fire that night, the archaeologists and translators spoke in low tones. Someone mentioned that similar texts had been found before, scattered across Mesopotamia, fragments of a greater archive. But none had been this complete, this clear, or this unsettling. They spoke of how the list described an age before the flood, a time when kingship descended from heaven, an age when rulers were more than mortal. The more they talked, the more the timeline pressed on their minds like a dark horizon they couldn't quite see beyond. Civilization, as textbooks teach, began around 6,000 years ago. Yet here, a single clay tablet calmly claimed that rulers had reigned tens of thousands of years before that. If it was a myth, it was a strangely meticulous one. If it wasn't, it meant humanity's story was far older and far stranger than we dare imagine. One researcher confessed softly, "It's like we've stumbled on a chapter that was never meant to be read." Indeed, the King List didn't sound like a creation myth. It sounded like a record. And records are kept for a reason. They preserve memory. They preserve power. Perhaps they even preserve warning. The night grew colder. The wind shifted, carrying grains of ancient sand through the camp, as if the land itself was breathing. Somewhere out in the darkness, beyond the reach of light, history's oldest secrets waited, and the whispers from beneath Sumer were growing louder. This was not the end of a discovery. It was the beginning of a mystery. To understand why the Sumerian King List shook historians to their core, you must first understand how history is built, brick by brick, century by century. Modern archaeology frames human civilization within a few thousand years. The rise of Sumer around 4000 BCE, the flowering of ancient Egypt shortly after, and then the slow march of empires toward the present. This timeline has structure, logic, and evidence to support it. It's neat. It's chronological. It's rational. And then came a tablet that didn't just stretch that timeline, it shattered it. According to the King List, the first ruler, Alulim, reigned for 28,800 years. That single number alone predates not just recorded history, but entire climatic shifts in Earth's past. The total span of the antediluvian reigns, 241,200 years, places the beginning of kingship long before what we even consider human civilization. This isn't a small adjustment to history. It's like discovering a hidden ocean beneath a familiar map. The historians and linguists who examined the translation were forced into uncomfortable corners. Their carefully constructed timelines had no place to fit these reigns. They could accept myth. Yes, cultures have myths. But this tablet wasn't written in mythical language. It was recorded in administrative detail, the same format used to list taxes, land rights, and real kings centuries later. Some suggested it must have been a metaphor, a symbolic way to express divine greatness. Others pointed out that every name, every reign length, was deliberate and standardized, suggesting the writers truly believed in these numbers. But if the Sumerians believed kings ruled for millennia, why? What could inspire such vast spans of time to be carved with such precision? This is where the logic of history begins to bend, where archaeology meets something older, something that doesn't quite fit the framework. The King List was not merely a historical anomaly. It was a rebellion against time itself. The clay tablet did not speak in riddles. It spoke in names, names carved by hands that believed they were recording something eternal. Each line etched into the Sumerian King List wasn't just a historical entry, it was a declaration. These were not anonymous figures lost to the sands. They were rulers whose names had endured for thousands of years before even the first pyramid was built. The list began with Anunnaki, the king of Eridu, said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Then Anunnaki for 36,000 years. Each name carved into the clay carried a weight, not of mythic abstraction, but of official record-keeping. Then came Inmin-Luana, Inmin-Galana, and Demused the shepherd. Their reigns spanned tens of thousands of years, each more impossible than the last, yet presented with the same calm precision used to document ordinary kings centuries later. For the Sumerians, writing wasn't casual. To etch into clay was to make a claim of permanence, a contract with time itself. The scribes pressed their styluses not on fragile parchment, but on tablets meant to outlive empires. And they succeeded. Millennia later, these names still speak, not with sound, but with a steady, silent defiance of the modern timeline. When researchers ran their fingers over the cuneiform impressions, they weren't just touching ancient writing. They were tracing the echoes of rulers who either belonged to a forgotten civilization or to a myth so meticulously recorded it blurred the boundary between legend and history. The names weren't poetic inventions. They were structured, categorized, aligned with cities, and associated with specific durations. That detail is what unsettled scholars the most. Myths are fluid, but records are rigid. Legends sing, but ledgers count. The King List didn't sing of these kings. It counted their years. It measured their reigns. And in those measurements lay the most haunting whisper of all. Someone long ago wanted the world to remember them exactly as they were. Not as gods, not as legends, but as rulers of time itself. The question lingered in the minds of everyone who studied the Sumerian King List. Were these names truly kings, or were they something else entirely? The Sumerians described the earliest rulers as the ones who held kingship descended from heaven, a phrase repeated with unwavering precision. It wasn't a metaphor to them. It was a statement of origin. These rulers were not said to have claimed power. They were said to have inherited it from the sky. For ordinary human kings, the records spoke of war, building, and governance. But for the earliest antediluvian kings, figures like Anunnaki and Anunnaki, there were no accounts of conquest or succession. They appeared in the records already enthroned, already ruling, as if they emerged from the heavens fully formed. Their reigns lasted for tens of thousands of years, far beyond the span of mortal life. The implication was unnerving. These figures weren't merely human rulers glorified after death. They were depicted as divine beings. Sumerian belief was rooted in the presence of the Anunnaki, powerful deities, or celestial visitors who governed human affairs. The King List placed these kings in the same breath as those heavenly figures, blurring the line between myth and monarchy. To the Sumerians, kingship was not a human invention, but a divine transmission. It descended from the sky, just as the flood would later descend from the heavens to reset the world. This blending of kings and gods unsettled modern scholars because it implied a worldview where human civilization began under the rule of something non-human. Whether gods, advanced beings, or symbolic archetypes, these figures represented a time when the mortal and the divine were intertwined. To the ancients, the idea of a god-king wasn't fantasy, it was history. And that may be why their names were recorded with such unwavering precision. To erase them would have meant erasing the very beginning of kingship itself. So the question remained, were these kings divine myth or echoes of a forgotten reality that modern history no longer has room for? To the outside world, the Sumerian King List may look like a simple clay tablet, another relic of an ancient civilization. But to the scribes who carved those wedge-shaped marks into wet clay thousands of years ago, it was not just writing. It was an act of obedience, and perhaps fear. Sumerian scribes were not mere record keepers. They were the voices of power. Every stroke of the stylus carried weight. To inscribe a king's reign was to affirm their divine right. And to make a mistake on such a record was considered more than an error. It was almost a sacrilege. The early entries on the tablet, naming rulers like Alulim and Alanger, show a level of precision and reverence that goes beyond ordinary administrative writing. The script is sharp, deliberate, without hesitation, like someone carving truth into time itself. Many historians have noted something strange. The language used in the King List's earliest sections is colder than in later records. There's no flourish, no praise hymns, no poetic glorification. Just names, durations, facts. Almost as if the scribes were recording something they dared not embellish. Some scholars have speculated that the scribes themselves might have been under a form of ritual obligation, bound to preserve these numbers exactly as they had been given, perhaps by religious decree or cultural fear. In Sumerian society, writing was sacred. The stylus was as much a tool of worship as of record-keeping. Imagine a young scribe in the dim light of an oil lamp, his hands steady but his heart pounding, pressing each line of cuneiform into the clay. He isn't inventing, he's repeating what has been commanded to endure. And as he etches reigns of 36,000 or 43,200 years, he must wonder, who were these kings truly? How can a name stretch across ages? There's a certain kind of silence that exists in such moments, a silence heavier than speech. The King List carries that silence still. It is the silence of men who wrote without question, preserving a story that perhaps even they were afraid to fully understand. When the Sumerian King List is read aloud, one question inevitably rises like a shadow behind every line. How can a king rule for 36,000 years? This isn't just an academic puzzle, it's a direct challenge to our understanding of what it means to be human. A human life, even at its longest, can barely reach a century. So what kind of being sits upon a throne for millennia? The ancient Sumerians didn't shy away from this idea. To them, the earliest kings were not ordinary mortals. They were described as those to whom kingship had descended from heaven. Their reigns were measured in thousands upon thousands of years, not because scribes were careless, but because longevity was expected of such rulers. Whether these reigns were literal or symbolic, the belief in a different kind of lifespan was embedded deeply into their worldview. Immortality in Sumerian thought wasn't always about living forever. It was about outlasting the ordinary. These god-kings may have been perceived as existing on a different scale of time entirely, their lives measured not by years, but by ages. To the people of Sumer, the idea of a ruler who reigned for thousands of years wasn't absurd. It was a sign of divine legitimacy. Modern scholars wrestle with this notion. Some argue the numbers are astronomical cycles, cleverly encoded. Others suggest mythological exaggeration. But a growing group of researchers whisper about something more unsettling. What if these stories preserve distorted memories of real beings, not quite gods, not quite men, who walked the earth long before recorded civilization? Immortality, in this sense, may not refer to endless life, but to an existence that transcends human limitations. The King List doesn't just ask us to believe in long-lived kings. It asks us to confront the possibility that humanity's timeline may once have been shared with something other. And in that quiet, ancient gap between myth and memory, the question of immortality lingers, not as a legend, but as an unanswered truth. Every civilization has its boundaries, not just in maps, but in time. Modern historians and archaeologists draw a firm line around the birth of civilization, roughly 6,000 years ago. Before that, humanity was a collection of hunter-gatherers slowly organizing, inventing agriculture, and building the first cities. That timeline feels secure, measurable, rational. It is the foundation on which our understanding of human history rests. But the Sumerian King List doesn't just step over that boundary. It obliterates it. The tablet calmly lists 8 rulers reigning for a total of 241,200 years before what it calls the flood. Not 2,400 years. Not 24,000. 241,000 years. A span that reaches deep into the Paleolithic era, long before recorded human civilization. This single number is a silent rebellion against everything modern history claims to know. To accept this timeline literally would mean accepting that structured society, monarchy, writing, and cities existed hundreds of thousands of years before the conventional dawn of civilization. It would mean acknowledging either an entirely lost chapter of human history or something even stranger. That is why most historians do not accept it. They cannot. To do so would unravel everything. The timelines, the theories, the structures built on centuries of scholarship. And yet, the King List does not blink. It presents these reigns with the same tone as later, verifiable kings. It doesn't hint, it states. So scholars push the numbers into the realm of metaphor, calling them symbolic, astronomical, or ritualistic. But each explanation feels like trying to wrap a river in string, tidy on the surface, but never holding the full current. The timeline the King List presents is not one history can accept, at least, not without rewriting itself. And that uncomfortable truth lingers like a stone under the skin of archaeology, unmovable, undeniable, and quietly waiting. When the Sumerian King List reaches the end of its antediluvian rulers, it doesn't describe a peaceful transition. It ends with a flood, sudden, devastating, world-changing. The text states simply, and without flourish, then the flood swept over. Those 4 words act like a blade, cutting the timeline of humanity in two: the age of god-kings before the deluge, and the age of mortal kings after. The flood isn't unique to Sumerian myth. Echoes of a great deluge ripple across cultures worldwide. From the tale of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh to the story of Noah in the Book of Genesis, to flood legends in India, China, and even the Americas, it's as though memory itself carries a watermark. Many civilizations that had never met still share a strangely similar story: a world before, a great flood, and a world reborn. For the Sumerians, this was more than myth. The King List treats the flood as a historical reset button. Everything that came before belonged to a different kind of world, one where rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years, where kingship descended from heaven. Everything after belonged to human kings, mortal, shorter reigns, measurable time. Scholars have wrestled with this line for decades. Was it based on a real catastrophic flood in ancient Mesopotamia? Geological evidence suggests massive floods occurred in the region thousands of years ago. But what if the King List isn't just describing a single river's flooding? What if it's pointing to a global memory, the kind that burns itself into humanity's collective story? This is the eerie part. Civilizations separated by oceans seem to remember the same cataclysm. The flood doesn't explain the 241,200-year timeline, but it marks its end. In this way, the flood becomes more than a myth. It becomes a boundary stone in time, sealing away an age of impossible kings and forgotten history beneath the rising waters. History, as we are taught, moves in a straight line. Hunter-gatherers evolve into farmers. Farmers build cities. Cities become empires. But the Sumerian King List whispers of something older and far less linear. It tells of a world that existed, flourished, and then ended, only for a new world to rise in its place. This isn't just a story of rulers, it's the story of civilizations that come and go in cycles. When the King List divides its timeline between the age before the flood and the age after, it's hinting at a pattern. Civilization didn't just begin once. It may have risen and fallen long before our accepted history began. The antediluvian kings ruled for impossibly long spans, tens of thousands of years each, suggesting a stable, powerful society or something that transcended what we define as civilization. Archaeologists have long debated the possibility of lost civilizations. Most dismiss it as speculation. Yet across the globe, scattered traces of sophisticated knowledge appear where they shouldn't. Advanced astronomical alignments, precise measurements in megalithic structures, myths that seem too consistent to be coincidence. Many of these clues don't fit the neat, linear timeline of human development. The King List frames the flood not just as a disaster, but as the turning of an age. An old world collapses. A new one rises. Kingship is said to descend from heaven again after the deluge. as though the blueprint of civilization itself had been preserved and reissued. What if this isn't just Sumerian myth, but a glimpse of how the ancients understood time? Not as a straight road, but as a wheel, civilizations emerging, peaking, and vanishing, leaving only fragments for future ages to rediscover. The modern world sees itself as the pinnacle of history. But if the King List is to be believed, we may simply be living in one of many turns of that vast and ancient wheel. And beneath our cities, perhaps, lies the dust of others that came before, civilizations whose stories were swept away by time and flood, only to be whispered again through clay. For centuries, scholars and skeptics alike have wrestled with the same question. Could the Sumerian King List be a myth carefully wrapped in the language of history? Not every story is meant to be taken literally. Some are encoded, hidden behind layers of numbers, symbols, and cosmic metaphors that only make sense to those who understand their language. The numbers themselves are the first clue. Reigns lasting tens of thousands of years sound impossible by modern standards, but they may represent something else entirely. Some researchers have proposed that these long durations might correspond to astronomical cycles, like the precession of the equinoxes, planetary alignments, or even great ages of the world. In this interpretation, Alulim's 28,800-year reign may not mean one man ruled for that long, but that his name represented a cosmic period, perhaps the reign of a celestial force or age. Ancient civilizations often encoded their deepest knowledge in myths, hiding science in stories that survived across generations. Egyptian, Vedic, and Mesoamerican texts all contain numbers that correspond to astronomical patterns. It is possible the Sumerians did the same, embedding cosmic knowledge in their royal chronology, ensuring it outlasted the collapse of empires. But encoded myth doesn't diminish the mystery, it deepens it. Because if these reigns represent cosmic cycles, it means the Sumerians possessed extraordinary knowledge of time. Knowledge far more advanced than what we typically credit to early civilizations. And so the debate splits in two, those who see myth as myth, and those who see it as a veil, concealing a more profound truth. Perhaps the god-kings never walked the earth in human form. Or perhaps they did, and their stories became constellations, encoded in clay so they could be remembered long after the stars they followed had shifted. Either way, the King List is not just telling a story. It is hiding something in plain sight. Every great mystery has a line it crosses, a moment when curiosity brushes against something that feels forbidden. The Sumerian King List lives on that line. It's not just another artifact. It is a seed of a history that challenges everything modern scholarship holds as fact. A tablet that calmly speaks of kings ruling for 241,200 years is not simply unusual, it's subversive. Academic institutions thrive on consistency, timelines, and the comfort of evidence that fits like puzzle pieces. But the King List is a piece that doesn't fit anywhere. It belongs to a puzzle no one admits exists. It tells of an era when kingship came from the sky, civilizations rose before the flood, and rulers spanned time as though mortality were a choice. If these claims are dismissed as myth, they still reveal how much the ancients believed in an older, vanished world. If they're not myth, then the implications are vast and unsettling. Over the years, these ideas have been quietly pushed to the fringes, labeled pseudo-history or alternative theories. Yet they keep resurfacing, like seeds scattered across centuries, refusing to be buried. Whispers of advanced knowledge, lost civilizations, and divine rulers echo in other myths too: Egyptian god-kings, Vedic yugas, Mesoamerican ages of the world. Different lands, different voices, but eerily similar themes. Some researchers suggest the King List preserves a memory of something real, a hidden chapter erased by time and flood, remembered only in fragments. Others warn that some truths were never meant to be unearthed. But the tablet remains, silent and unyielding. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It simply exists, as though waiting for someone brave enough to read between its lines. And in its numbers and names, it plants a dangerous thought. What if the history we know is only the surface, and beneath it a much older story sleeps, waiting to awaken. In the oldest texts of Sumer, long before empires carved their names into stone, a single phrase appears again and again. Kingship descended from heaven. To the people who lived in that fertile land between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, those words were not metaphor. They were history. At the heart of this idea are the Anunnaki, the sky beings, the great gods who, according to Sumerian belief, came not from nearby lands, but from above. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki with a kind of reverence that went beyond ordinary deities. Unlike many mythologies where gods were distant, the Anunnaki were said to walk among humans. They taught knowledge, gave kings their right to rule, and established order. It was these sky beings, the texts claim, who brought kingship to earth, an act that marked the beginning of the impossible reigns carved into the Sumerian King List. But who are they really? To mainstream historians, the Anunnaki are mythological deities representing forces of nature, celestial bodies, or ancient ideals. But to those who look between the lines, they may represent something else. Beings interpreted as gods by early humans, perhaps travelers or rulers of unknown origin. Descriptions in temple hymns and creation myths speak of their bright appearance, their descent in chariots of the sky, their ability to command wind and storm. Whether symbolic or literal, these details fueled centuries of speculation. Their names echo through other cultures under different masks: divine visitors, shining ones, sky fathers, star gods. And their arrival is always tied to beginnings of law, agriculture, writing, and rule. So when the King List claims kingship descended from heaven, it isn't just a poetic flourish. It is pointing to a moment in prehistory that the Sumerians believed was triggered by these sky beings. Were the Anunnaki gods advanced rulers, or something else entirely? That question lingers like starlight, ancient, cold, and waiting to be answered. To understand the mystery of the Anunnaki, one must step into the world of Sumerian myth not as fantasy, but as testimony. Their stories weren't written for entertainment. They were preserved on clay tablets as records of what their ancestors claimed to have seen and experienced. In these texts, the Anunnaki were not distant, invisible gods. They were beings who arrived, who appeared, who ruled. Ancient hymns and epics describe their presence with an unsettling clarity. They are called the Shining Ones, beings of brilliant countenance who descended from the sky like blazing eagles. In temple carvings and reliefs, they are often depicted towering over humans, clothed in intricate garments, wearing horned headdresses, symbols of divinity and power. Unlike later deities who became abstract and cosmic, the Anunnaki were described with human-like features, yet larger, stronger, and more radiant. The Enuma Elish and other Sumerian creation epics often position the Anunnaki as intermediaries between the higher cosmic powers and humanity. They assigned tasks, divided lands, and bestowed kingship. They were organized like a ruling council, each with defined domains: agriculture, water, storms, wisdom. It wasn't the chaotic pantheon of mythic storytelling. It read more like a structured hierarchy. Even more compelling are references to their arrival from the heavens, their chariots of fire, their boats that shone like the sun, their ability to traverse between the stars and the earth. Whether symbolic or literal, the texts treat these events as factual occurrences that mark the beginning of a new age for humanity. For the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were the architects of civilization. And if their accounts are even partially grounded in memory, then what they saw might not have been gods as we imagine them, but something that appeared godlike to early humanity. Their legacy wasn't carved in vague legend. It was etched into the foundations of a people who believed they had stood in the shadow of the sky beings. The ancient Sumerians did not have words for technology as we understand it today. To them, anything that flew, glowed, or roared with power belonged to the realm of the divine. So when the Anunnaki are described descending from the sky in bright chariots, or when their temples are said to hum with the breath of the gods, the line between technology and mythology blurs in ways that still fascinate researchers. Some historians interpret these passages as poetic metaphors, symbolic ways of describing the forces of nature. But others have dared to ask, What if the Sumerians were trying, in the only language they had, to describe advanced technology? To a Bronze Age mind, a shining vessel descending from above could only be a divine chariot. A voice amplified through unknown means might be called the voice of a god. A beam of light or a control blast could become the breath of heaven. Temple inscriptions speak of the gods who could ascend to the stars, who traveled in boats of the sky, who controlled the tablet of destinies, an object granting command over both heaven and earth. These descriptions are strangely technical in tone, lacking the fluid, dreamlike qualities found in pure myth. They sound like someone witnessing power they could not replicate but tried to record faithfully. Of course, mainstream archaeology attributes this to mythological imagination, the human need to explain the unknown with gods and legends. Yet, the consistency of these descriptions across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts leaves an unsettling question. Were these just stories or fragmented memories of encounters with something beyond their comprehension? The Anunnaki's divine abilities, flight, control over elements, near immortality, can be interpreted either as poetic reverence or technological superiority. Whether gods, alien visitors, or legendary kings, to the Sumerians, their power was real. And sometimes what looks like magic in one age may simply be technology out of its time. In the Sumerian King List, there is a single phrase that echoes like a ritual chant through the centuries. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. To the Sumerians, this wasn't metaphorical language. It was a historical event. Kingship, the divine right to rule, was not invented by men. It was granted from above. The concept of heaven to the Sumerians wasn't simply a spiritual realm. Their word for heaven was both a divine domain and a literal sky. When they said kingship descended from heaven, they meant it arrived from the stars, bestowed by the Anunnaki, who acted as cosmic rulers and regulators of human civilization. This belief shaped the foundation of their entire political and religious structure. In their worldview, a king was not merely a political leader, he was the appointed representative of the gods, ruling through divine mandate. This is why the earliest rulers listed on the tablet, such as Alulim of Eridu, were depicted as more than human. They did not rise through inheritance or conquest. They were chosen, or so the records claim, by those who came from the sky. This idea of divine kingship didn't die with Sumer. It echoed through later empires, the god-kings of ancient Egypt, the mandate of heaven in ancient China, and even the divine right of kings in medieval Europe. But in Sumer, the story was far more literal. The descent of kingship wasn't just spiritual authority. It was described as a physical event, a transfer of power from celestial beings to humanity. Imagine what that would have meant to the people of the time, a moment when the sky was no longer distant and silent, but active, a source of order, law, and power. To them, the king was the bridge between worlds, the living proof that their gods had chosen them. And so kingship was not earned. It descended, like fire from the heavens, like a torch passed from star to soil. And in that descent, the world as they knew it began. History often hinges on a single moment, a shift so profound that everything after it is different. In Sumerian memory, that moment is when kingship descended from heaven. According to the Sumerian King List and related myths, the arrival of the Anunnaki wasn't just the beginning of a dynasty. It was the beginning of a new world. Before this descent, the earth was a place of tribes, scattered communities, and primordial chaos. Then the texts claim the sky opened. Power did not rise from the soil. It fell from above. And from that moment, humanity was no longer alone. Kingship, law, agriculture, celestial calendars, and monumental building suddenly appear in the archaeological record as if from nowhere. Civilization, it seems, ignited overnight. In mythic accounts, the Anunnaki didn't arrive as conquerors. They arrived as organizers, bringing structure where there was none. The earliest city, Eridu, is described as the first place where divine rule touched the earth. Alulim, its first king, is not portrayed as a warlord, but as one chosen to administer a gift from the sky. This moment set a pattern that would echo for thousands of years. Kings as semi-divine figures, ruling not by human strength, but by heavenly authority. It's easy to dismiss this as myth, a civilization trying to explain its sudden rise through divine narrative. But the timing is curious. Archaeological layers show that cities, agriculture, and organized religion appear in Mesopotamia with astonishing speed. For those who believe in a literal descent, this was the day the heavens intervened in human affairs. For the Sumerians, this was not legend. It was the turning point, when the world they knew began, when humans became subjects of a greater plan, and when the line between gods and men blurred forever. That single descent marked the first step into an age of kings, empires, and myths that still shape our world today. The sky had spoken, and humanity would never be the same again. In the dry southern plains of modern-day Iraq, where the Euphrates River once flowed with ancient strength, lies a quiet mound of sun-baked earth and scattered stone. To the untrained eye, it looks like little more than a forgotten ruin. But to archaeologists and historians, this place is something far greater. This is Eridu, believed to be the first city in human history. Long before Babylon rose in glory, before the pyramids of Giza, before most of what we call civilization had a name, Eridu already stood. Today, the site is eerily silent. The desert wind brushes across the remains of temples and foundations where thousands once walked. The sand has swallowed streets that once echoed with the language of the first scribes. But in that silence lies a weight, a memory of beginnings. For the Sumerians, Eridu wasn't just a city. It was the place where kingship descended from heaven, the earthly seat of the first ruler, Alulim, whose reign the Sumerian King List claims lasted 28,800 years. Archaeological digs have revealed the ruins of layered temples, each built over the remains of the last, a staircase of history, descending deeper and deeper into time. This layering suggests that Eridu wasn't just abandoned and rebuilt. It was continuously revered, as though its location itself held sacred power. Even later Sumerians considered it the spiritual center of their world, the home of Enki, the god of wisdom and creation. Walking through the ruins today, one can almost feel the contrast between then and now. Where once stood a city pulsing with divine purpose, now lies a hollowed echo. But echoes have power. The stones may be silent, yet they speak of a time when humanity's first steps toward civilization were not taken alone. Eridu is not just an archaeological site. It's a threshold between myth and memory, between the world of mortals and the realm where, according to ancient texts, gods once walked among men. Long before the invention of telescopes, before modern science named constellations, the people of Eridu lifted their eyes to the heavens with a precision that still puzzles researchers today. The earliest temple complexes uncovered at the site weren't arranged haphazardly. They were aligned to the stars. Carved into the earth and stone, their foundations mirror celestial movements with remarkable accuracy, suggesting that the Sumerians possessed not only spiritual devotion, but astronomical knowledge centuries ahead of their time. The central temple, dedicated to Enki, god of wisdom, water, and creation, was built in stages, each layer replacing the last. But with every reconstruction, one thing remained constant: its orientation. Researchers have found its axis aligns closely with the rising of key stars and constellations visible in the Mesopotamian sky around 5000 BCE. This is no coincidence. It implies ritual precision, a deliberate attempt to keep heaven and earth in harmony. For the Sumerians, the stars were not distant suns. They were signs from the gods, markers of cycles and divine will. Aligning temples to the heavens was a way to anchor the cosmic order on earth. In their worldview, kingship itself had descended from the sky, so aligning their sacred spaces to the stars was both an act of reverence and of obedience. Some scholars believe these alignments may also have been functional, marking agricultural cycles, solstices, or celestial events crucial to early civilization. Others whisper of something deeper, a way to communicate with the gods, to open channels between worlds. Standing amid those crumbling walls today, One can still trace the lines in the earth where priests once looked up at the night sky, waiting for a star to rise at just the right moment. In Eridu, the stars were more than light. They were a map, a calendar, and perhaps a reminder of the place from which kingship and maybe something else had come. Long before empires rose, before kings wore crowns forged in gold, there was a name whispered through the sands of Sumer, Alulim. The Sumerian King List records him as the first king of Eridu, the first ruler after kingship descended from heaven. His reign is said to have lasted 28,800 years, a number so vast it stretches the imagination beyond the bounds of recorded history. But for the Sumerians, this was not myth. It was the beginning of their world. Who was Alulim? The ancient texts give us few direct details, but what they do say is striking. He was not depicted as a conqueror or founder, but as a receiver of power, the one chosen when the Anunnaki brought kingship down from the heavens. His name itself is wrapped in mystery. In later traditions, he was associated with wisdom and order, guiding humanity out of primitive chaos into the structure of the first city, Eridu. Archaeologists can't dig up a 28,800-year reign, but they have uncovered layer after layer of settlement beneath Eridu's sands, some older than any other urban center on Earth. Whether or not a man named Alulim ever walked those streets, the idea of his rule shaped everything that came after. To the Sumerians, Alulim was more than a king. He was the link between earth and sky, between gods and mortals. Priests sang hymns to him centuries after his supposed reign. Later kings invoked his name to legitimize their own power, claiming they followed the ancient order established in Eridu. If Gilgamesh was legend, Alulim was something more, a foundational myth, or perhaps, to some believers, a real being whose rule set the rhythm of human destiny. His reign marks the beginning of time as the Sumerians counted it. And whether fact, legend, or a memory of something now lost, the shadow of Alulim stretches across thousands of years, whispering of a world that once was, a world where kings ruled under the watchful eyes of the sky. Beneath the sun-hardened soil of Eridu, archaeologists have unearthed more than just mud brick walls and broken pottery. They have found objects that defy easy explanation, artifacts and symbols unlike anything expected from the earliest known city on Earth. Small, intricate carvings, unusual materials, and recurring patterns suggest that Eridu was more than a simple settlement. It was a place of purpose, a center of something ancient and powerful. One of the most intriguing finds is a series of small, finely detailed cylinder seals, each bearing scenes that seem oddly sophisticated for their age. These seals depict winged figures, towering over humans, often standing beside what appear to be star maps or celestial symbols. Some figures are shown holding objects that resemble staffs, rods, or even devices that modern eyes can't help but interpret as technological. Then there are the strange symbols etched into temple foundations. Some align with known Sumerian religious motifs, but others don't match any cataloged language or iconography. Repeated spiral shapes, concentric rings, and geometric patterns appear again and again, leading some researchers to suggest they may represent celestial events or knowledge far beyond simple agricultural astronomy. Another mystery lies in the materials themselves. Fragments of objects that seem to be made from non-local stone have been found, stones traced to distant regions hundreds of miles away, long before formal trade routes are believed to have existed. How did they arrive in Eridu? Who brought them? And why? To the Sumerians, Eridu was the place where the gods first walked the earth. To modern archaeologists, it is a puzzle box, a city whose artifacts tell a story that feels both familiar and alien. Whether these symbols were religious art, encoded knowledge, or remnants of something else entirely, they suggest a civilization that was already looking to the stars, already listening to whispers from beyond their world. And in the quiet halls of that first city, those symbols still speak, even if we no longer understand their language. Every great city has a beginning, and every beginning carries the shadow of an end. Eridu, the first city of kings, the birthplace of Sumerian civilization, was no exception. Once a thriving spiritual and political center, it slowly began to fade, not with a dramatic fall, but with a long, quiet disappearance. Its decline remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the ancient world. For centuries, Eridu was revered as sacred ground. Its temples were rebuilt layer upon layer, each generation adding to the legacy of the city where kingship was said to have descended from heaven. Pilgrims came from distant lands. Priests worshipped in the temple of Enki. Kings invoked the name of Alulim to legitimize their rule, and then slowly, inexplicably, ended. Archaeological layers show that water levels began to shift. Canals silted up. The Euphrates River slowly moved away, strangling the city's lifeline. Climate changes may have played a part, but many researchers believe something more happened, a cultural and spiritual shift. As nearby Uruk rose in power, Eridu's temples fell silent. The priests left. The pilgrims stopped coming. The cradle of civilization turned to dust. But this is where the story grows stranger. The city was never destroyed by war. There are no signs of burning, no great battle scars, no sudden collapse. Eridu simply faded, like a voice falling quiet, as though whatever purpose it once served was fulfilled and then abandoned. Some scholars see this as a natural evolution of early urban centers. Others, drawn to the whispers of the Anunnaki legend, wonder if Eridu's vanishing marks the moment when the gods departed, taking their power with them. Today, the ruins stand silent beneath an unrelenting sun. The city that birthed kingship and shaped the earliest myths of humanity vanished without a trace of war, leaving only questions buried beneath sand. Eridu began with a whisper from the sky, and it ended with a silence just as deep. When reading the Sumerian King List, one phrase rises like a drumbeat in a ritual, constant, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Kingship descended from heaven. It appears not once, not twice, but multiple times, always marking a new beginning, a turning of eras. To the Sumerians, this was not a poetic flourish. It was a statement of origin, an unshakable truth. Each repetition of this phrase occurs at pivotal points in the narrative. The first comes before the city of Eridu is named, when power first fell from the sky. Then again, after the Great Flood, when kingship is said to have descended from heaven once more, this time to Kish, marking a new world order. These words do not simply indicate political shifts. They imply a cosmic event, as if authority itself was being handed down from a realm beyond human reach. For Sumerian scribes, this phrase held sacred weight. In their worldview, power was not earned by men. It was bestowed by those above. By repeating the phrase in their royal chronicle, they weren't just recording history. They were reinforcing a divine narrative. Every king was a successor to something greater than his throne. Modern scholars have debated its meaning endlessly. Some interpret it as religious symbolism, a way of sanctifying rulers to ensure obedience. Others see it as a memory wrapped in myth, a remnant of something the Sumerians themselves believe happened, a descent, a transfer of power from the heavens. But there is something chillingly precise about how the phrase is placed. It does not appear randomly. It frames transitions from one city to another, from one age to the next, from a world before the flood to the world after. It marks beginnings. To the people of Sumer, the sky was not an unreachable expanse. It was the origin point of kingship, the place where their world began. And each time those words were written on clay, they were not just telling a story, they were echoing a moment when everything changed. Long before modern monarchies and constitutional crowns, long before dynasties etched their names into stone, there existed a far older idea, one that was not political but cosmic. The Sumerians believed kingship was not a human invention. It was a gift. When they wrote "kingship descended from heaven" in the Sumerian King List, they were declaring that no king rose by his own will. He was chosen, not by men, but by gods. This was the ancient foundation of divine right. In Eridu, Kish, and later cities of Sumer, the ruler was more than a political figure. He was the earthly representative of celestial authority. His power was not questioned because it came from beyond the sky. This belief gave the king a dual identity, part human, part divine intermediary. His decrees carried the weight of the heavens themselves. This concept of divine kingship didn't die with Sumer. It echoed through millennia. In the god-kings of ancient Egypt, the mandate of heaven in ancient China, the divine emperors of Japan, and even the medieval divine right of kings in Europe. But Sumer's version was different. It wasn't symbolic or ceremonial. It was presented as an event, the moment when beings from the heavens, the Anunnaki, bestowed rule upon humanity. This belief shaped every layer of their society. Law, ritual, and war were all tied to the idea that their king ruled because heaven had willed it so. Temples were built to honor not just the gods, but the connection between ruler and the celestial realm. Even rebellion was seen as more than political disobedience. It was defiance against the cosmic order. To modern eyes, divine right may look like superstition or a tool of power. But to the Sumerians, it was the truth of their world. A king without heaven's blessing was not a king at all. And so their history begins not with conquest, but with descent, not from the mountains, but from the stars. The belief that power comes from the heavens did not end with the fall of Sumer. It echoed through the corridors of time, reshaping itself again and again in the rise of later empires. The phrase kingship descended from heaven became a kind of spiritual blueprint, a legacy that rulers across the world would use to legitimize their reign. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs were not merely kings. They were living gods, embodiments of divine order on earth. Their authority came from the gods, and the cosmic balance depended on their rule. Temples and tombs were carved with celestial imagery, showing the pharaoh ascending to the stars, just as the earliest Sumerian kings were said to have received their power from above. Far to the east, the Zhou dynasty of China built its political foundation on the mandate of heaven. Here, the ruler was seen as the son of heaven, his right to rule directly tied to cosmic harmony. If disaster struck, famine, earthquakes, rebellion, it was a sign that heaven had withdrawn its favor. This is strikingly similar to the Sumerian notion that kingship could be removed and passed to another city when divine authority shifted. Even in medieval Europe, the concept endured. The divine right of kings asserted that monarchs were chosen by God and answered to no mortal authority. Crowns gleamed beneath cathedral ceilings, but their roots stretched back to ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets and the whispered phrase that began it all. What's remarkable is not just the repetition of this idea, but its universality. Cultures separated by thousands of miles and centuries still anchored their power to the sky. Whether through the stars, the gods, or divine mandate, they looked upward to justify authority below. The Sumerians may have been the first to carve the idea into stone, but they were not the last to believe it. In every empire that followed, the throne was never just a seat of power. It was a bridge to the heavens, a reminder that kings, no matter how mighty, ruled at the will of something far greater. When the Sumerian King List declares that kingship descended from heaven, it leaves us with one of the most tantalizing questions in ancient history. What did the Sumerians actually mean by descent? Was it purely spiritual, a metaphor for divine blessing, or did they intend something far more literal? To the Sumerians, heaven was not some distant, unreachable paradise. It was a real place, a realm inhabited by the Anunnaki, powerful sky beings who bestowed authority upon humanity. So when they spoke of descent, they were not referring to abstract faith. They were pointing to a moment of arrival, a transfer of rule from the heavens to earth. Some scholars interpret this descent as the formalization of divine authority, priests or chosen rulers receiving a heavenly mandate through rituals, celestial events, or symbolic ceremonies. Others, particularly in alternative historical theories, propose that the descent may reflect a literal encounter, a memory of something extraordinary, recorded in the only language ancient people had, myth. Temple inscriptions and hymns describe gods landing on sacred mountains or descending in shining boats. These are not vague metaphors. They are structured accounts, repeating the same imagery across multiple texts and cities. The descent always precedes a shift in power, a new king, a new city, a new age. It is also significant that kingship does not arise from heaven, it descends. This implies an action, a deliberate movement downward, as if something once held in the sky was delivered into human hands. Whether this referred to celestial omens, ritual communication, or a mysterious phenomenon, the Sumerians saw it as the moment when the world changed. To them, kingship wasn't discovered, it was given. And the act of giving came from above, not below. Perhaps descent was their way of preserving a memory too vast to fully explain. A moment they experienced, but future generations could only whisper about through clay and myth. To the people of Sumer, kingship was more than a political tool. It was a force larger than humanity itself. When they etched the phrase kingship descended from heaven into clay, they were describing a power that did not belong to men, only passed through them. The king was not its owner. He was its bearer. In the Sumerian King List, rulers appear like stars in a constellation. One city holds power, then it moves to the next, carried on the winds of fate. This fluidity reflects an underlying belief that kingship was not bound to bloodlines or ambition, but with a heavenly current, invisible, unstoppable, and beyond human control. If the gods withdrew their favor, even the mightiest city would fall. If they granted it elsewhere, even a humble village could rise to rule. This concept gave Sumerian rulers both immense authority and crushing fragility. They were revered as chosen figures, almost divine, but their power could vanish with a single divine breath. It was not their throne to keep, only to hold until heaven decided otherwise. That's why rituals, offerings, and temple construction were not just acts of devotion. They were negotiations with the sky, attempts to hold onto a power that was never fully theirs. This belief shaped their entire worldview. Law came from the gods. Order came from above. Human hands could build cities and armies, but they could not create kingship. That authority flowed from the heavens like a river feeding the world below. In later empires, this idea was often masked behind crowns and ceremonies. But in ancient Sumer, it was raw and unembellished. Power did not rise from man. It descended from beyond. To rule was to touch something greater, something dangerous, something no mortal could truly control. And perhaps that is why every king in the Sumerian record eventually fades, but the power itself never does. It moves, it shifts, it endures, always watching from above. Top of form. Long before the cataclysm, before rivers swelled and the world was swallowed by water, Sumer was a land of kings, gods, and cities that glimmered like jewels in the desert sun. According to the Sumerian King List, this was an age unlike any that followed, a time of impossible reigns, skyborn rulers, and civilizations that flourished for tens of thousands of years. The text speaks of 8 great kings who ruled before the flood, their combined reign stretching over 241,200 years. In their time, cities like Eridu, Badtibara, and Larik were said to thrive under the guidance of the Anunnaki. These weren't just settlements of mud and reeds. The Sumerians described them as places touched by the heavens, where divine kingship shaped law, knowledge, and power. Life in this mythical antediluvian world was ordered by the stars. Temples aligned to celestial movements, kings claimed their authority from above, and rituals sought to keep the balance between heaven and earth. It was an age of structure, an era the Sumerians saw as the first great chapter of human existence. And yet, in their stories, a shadow slowly grows. The harmony between gods and men faltered. The divine order shifted. Something was coming. Across cultures, in the Book of Genesis, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in flood myths from India to Mesoamerica, this shadow takes the same form, a flood, vast and merciless. To the Sumerians, it wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a reset, a boundary line between the world before and the world after. What came before the deluge was not primitive. It was grand, powerful, and according to their own record, not entirely human. This was the age that vanished beneath the waves, leaving behind broken memories, scattered myths, and a silent question: what exactly was washed away? Civilizations rarely vanish in silence. Most crumble slowly, leaving behind layers of war, drought, or decline. But in the antediluvian world described by the Sumerian King List, the fall wasn't slow. It was sudden. One moment, 8 great kings ruled cities touched by the heavens. The next, the flood swept over. Those 4 words sever the longest timeline in human myth, drawing a clean, almost surgical line between a forgotten world and the dawn of recorded history. Archaeological records show that the earliest cities of Sumer, including Eridu and Ur, experienced abrupt interruptions in their growth around the same period. Thick silt layers buried some of the oldest structures, a silent testimony to a catastrophic flood. Temples were abandoned. Trade routes vanished. Populations migrated or disappeared entirely. It was as if the entire world the Sumerians knew was suddenly wiped clean. The myths are just as stark. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood comes not as a gentle rain, but as a cosmic storm, unleashed by the gods to erase an age they no longer favored. Only Utnapishtim survives, carrying the memory of a vanished world. This story mirrors countless flood legends worldwide, from the tale of Noah to the Indian Manu and the Aztec flood myths, all pointing to a shared cultural trauma, something catastrophic, something that came fast. The suddenness is what lingers. There are no stories of long decline, no battles or famines. Just a single overwhelming event, water swallowing cities, erasing kings, and resetting time. Whether the flood was a mythic retelling of a real environmental disaster or something far stranger, it became a pivot point in human memory. After the waters receded, the world was no longer the same. The god-kings were gone. The long reigns ended. A new history began, written on top of the silence they left behind. When the Sumerian King List reaches the line, then the flood swept over. It doesn't end, it begins again. After describing the fall of the first world, the text calmly introduces what scholars often call the Second King List, a new set of rulers, new cities, and a new order rising from the mud of a drowned age. This is one of the most intriguing transitions in ancient literature because it doesn't treat the flood as mythic finality, but as a reset point. The text reads, "After the flood had swept over, and when kingship had descended from heaven for the second time, kingship was in Kish." This is more than a line of succession. It's a cosmic statement. Just as kingship had once descended upon Eridu in the age before the deluge, now it descended again, this time upon Kish, marking the dawn of a new epoch. What's fascinating is how drastically different this second list is from the first. The antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. The post-flood kings ruled for humanly possible lifespans, decades, not millennia. It is as if time itself was rewritten. The divine, godlike rulers vanished, replaced by men who, though still chosen, were mortal. Archaeological evidence supports a kind of cultural restart in early Mesopotamia. After a period of devastation, new cities emerged, trade resumed, and writing evolved. The structure of kingship remained, but something had changed. The gods were still invoked, the heavens still honored, but the age of impossible reigns was over. This Second King List is more than a historical record. It's the moment humanity steps fully into its own story, inheriting a system once said to belong to sky beings. The flood didn't just wash away cities. It erased a way of life and ushered in a new one. The shift from Eridu to Kish marks a symbolic handover, from the divine age to the age of men. And with it, the myths of the Anunnaki began to drift from memory, becoming whispers on clay. In the silence that followed the flood, the ancient world stood still, a blank slate where once mighty cities had fallen. But from that silence came movement again. New settlements emerged along the rivers, fields were replanted, and civilization began to rise for a second time. The Sumerian King List describes this transition with chilling simplicity. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. This wasn't just the rebirth of a nation. It was the rebirth of an entire world. The first post-flood city to receive kingship was Kish, and this is no small detail. In Sumerian tradition, Kish represents a new order, an era where rulers were no longer god-kings reigning for tens of thousands of years, but mortals, ruling for spans of decades. This shift wasn't only political, it was cosmic. It was as if the heavens had set new rules for humanity, a reset of time itself. Archaeological layers from early Mesopotamia reveal clear signs of this rebirth. Cities rebuilt with different layouts, agricultural systems reorganized, new pottery styles emerging, and writing evolving into more structured forms. Temples were erected once again, this time simpler, less monumental, as though the gods had grown more distant, their presence less direct but still guiding. Yet despite this distance, the framework of kingship remained intact. The belief that authority flowed from the heavens endured, but was now filtered through human hands. Civilizations were no longer built under the shadows of immortal kings, but by mortals seeking to honor, and perhaps appease, powers above. This rebirth wasn't merely recovery, it was transformation. A new rhythm began to define humanity. Rise, build, rule, and remember. The flood had erased an age, but it had not erased the memory of kingship. It had been passed down like a torch from sky to earth, from the old world to the new. And in those first post-flood cities, humanity began to rewrite its destiny. When the Sumerian King List speaks of the Great Flood, it does not describe only the destruction of cities, it hints at the erasure of memory. Whole ages, stretching across 241,200 years, are summed up in a single line. Then the flood swept over. What was lost in that moment wasn't just kings and monuments, but the archives of an entire world. In the ruins of Eridu, Uruk, and other ancient cities, archaeologists have uncovered tablets dating from the centuries after the flood period, but very few from before. This absence isn't just an archaeological gap. It's a void, a silence where the earliest records of civilization should have been. It is as if history itself has been wiped clean. Ancient myths across cultures share this theme. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim preserves the story of a world that was erased. In the Book of Genesis, only Noah survives to carry forward knowledge into the New World. Other traditions, from India to the Andes, speak of sacred texts, maps, or knowledge lost beneath the waters. Some researchers believe that the flood myths may encode a cultural memory of real catastrophic events, a sudden climate shift, rising waters, or regional disasters that destroyed archives stored on perishable materials like clay, wood, or textiles. Others whisper about something far stranger, deliberate erasure, a cleansing of knowledge that belonged to a forbidden age, the time of the Anunnaki and their god-kings. What we do know is this: the earliest records we have come from a time after the flood. Whatever stories, sciences, maps, or rituals existed before were either destroyed or never meant to be recovered. The flood didn't just drown cities. It reset the archive of humanity. And so, history begins not at its true beginning, but at its second chapter, the part that survived. The rest lies beneath the mud, beneath rivers, perhaps forever. What was written before the waters rose? What knowledge was erased from the world? That is the riddle the flood left behind, a silence older than history itself. Long before modern nations measured time in hours and minutes, long before digital clocks ruled our lives, the ancient people of Sumer built their world on a mathematical foundation so enduring that we still use it today. That system is the sexagesimal system, a base 60 numerical structure that has outlived empires, religions, and languages. But its origin remains wrapped in mystery. Why base 60? Why not 10, like most civilizations eventually adopted? The Sumerians didn't stumble upon this number by accident. For them, 60 was a sacred number, tied to the heavens, to cycles, and to the divine order imposed by the Anunnaki. Unlike decimal systems, 60 divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, making it extraordinarily flexible for astronomy, geometry, and calendar keeping. To the Sumerians, mathematics was not just a tool. It was a language spoken by the gods. The sexagesimal system appears in some of the earliest surviving clay tablets, where scribes used wedges pressed into wet clay to record measurements of land, trade, and the movement of stars. The same systems structure their calendars, dividing the year and marking celestial cycles with uncanny precision. Even their concept of time, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle, is a direct inheritance from this ancient mathematical language. But what's most compelling is how advanced it was for its time. The earliest evidence of this system appears fully formed, not gradually developed. There are no earlier counting methods leading up to base 60 in Sumerian records. It's as if this knowledge arrived complete, already polished. Many scholars see this as the natural result of practical necessity. Others find it deeply curious that the system aligns so perfectly with astronomical cycles the Sumerians observed with extraordinary accuracy. In their worldview, mathematics was divine. Numbers weren't invented. They were revealed. And at the center of that revelation stood the number 60, the sacred fingerprint of the gods. The Sumerian King List is often read as a historical record of rulers, but hidden beneath the surface of its kingly names and reign lengths lies something more intricate: mathematics. The reigns of the 8 antediluvian kings, said to total 241,200 years, have long baffled historians. On the surface, these numbers seem absurd, mythical exaggerations. But when viewed through the lens of Sumerian mathematics, a different pattern emerges: encoded cycles. The Sumerians used the sexagesimal system, base 60, for counting and astronomical calculations. Interestingly, many of the reign lengths in the King List are divisible by 60 or by its multiples, suggesting they were not random numbers, but part of a deliberate structure. Take, for example, the reign of Alulim, the first king of Eridu, who is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. That number equals 480 times 60, a perfect sexagesimal expression. Other reigns follow similar patterns, creating a numeric rhythm that mirrors cosmic cycles, not human lifespans. To the Sumerians, kingship wasn't just divine, it was mathematically ordained. Each reign length appears to mark a celestial interval, possibly connected to planetary movements, star cycles, or precessional shifts. Rather than measuring literal years, these numbers may have represented epochs, symbolic ages when divine rule was anchored in a specific city. Even more striking is the total reign of 241,200 years itself. It is divisible by 3, 5, and 60, numbers considered sacred in Sumerian cosmology. This strongly suggests the King List was designed as a cosmic calendar, a way to encode the passage of divine eras in numerical language. Modern scholars debate whether this was early astronomy, ritual numerology, or both. But one thing is undeniable: the numbers weren't chosen carelessly. They encode meaning, layered like clay over stone. To the Sumerians, mathematics wasn't decoration. It was the architecture of history itself. The King List, then, may not just be a record of rulers. It may be a map of time, whispered in the language of numbers. To understand the world of Sumer, one must look upward, not just to their cities, but to their skies. For the Sumerians, mathematics and the heavens were inseparable. Their sexagesimal system wasn't simply a method of counting. It was a blueprint for mapping the cosmos. From the earliest temple alignments to the cycles hidden in the Sumerian King List, everything pointed toward the stars. Sumerian priests and astronomer scribes carefully observed the movements of planets and constellations. They tracked the lunar cycles, the heliacal rising of stars, and the shifting positions of celestial bodies over long spans of time. These observations were not merely practical. They were woven into the very structure of kingship and timekeeping. The heavens dictated when kingship descended, when cities rose to prominence, and when the great shifts of eras occurred. A key part of their celestial mapping was the division of the sky into 360 degrees, a circle mirroring their base 60 mathematics. 60 was not just a number to them. It was a symbol of cosmic order. Each degree, each division, corresponded to intervals of time, ritual, and power. This early astronomical system became the foundation upon which later civilizations built their calendars, star charts, and astrological traditions. Temple complexes like those in Eridu and Uruk were often aligned to specific stars or solstice points. Their orientations were not accidental. They were cosmic markers, anchoring cities to the heavens. In their worldview, kingship was legitimate only if it mirrored the celestial order. A king did not rule by conquest alone, but by aligning his reign with the movements of the stars. Some researchers suggest that the reign lengths in the king list may encode astronomical periods, possibly great cycles like precession or planetary conjunctions. Whether literal or symbolic, the Sumerians saw time itself as a reflection of the sky. To them, the heavens were a living clock, and mathematics was the language that made sense of it. Their rulers, their rituals, their records, all were synchronized to a celestial rhythm that still echoes through the calendars we use today. When modern readers encounter the reign lengths in the Sumerian King List, kings ruling for 28,800 years, 36,000 years, or even more, they instinctively search for logical explanations in human terms. But the Sumerians did not think of time the way we do. To them, time was not linear, nor was it merely the counting of days on a calendar. Time was a divine structure, woven into the fabric of the cosmos, and humanity lived within it, not beside it. The Sumerian priests and scribes saw time as cyclical. Ages began and ended when the heavens shifted, when planets aligned, stars rose, or kingship descended from heaven to a new city. A year could mean something far more symbolic than a single orbit of the sun. In many ancient texts, the concept of ashar, a Sumerian term, equaled 3,600 years. This unit of time appeared repeatedly in myth and mathematics, often tied to cosmic intervals. Thus, a king's reign of, say, 28,800 years might not describe a literal lifespan but 8 shar cycles, corresponding to celestial rhythms. This cosmic view of time also explains why the sexagesimal system, base 60, was central. 60 wasn't just practical, it was sacred. It represented the perfect structure of time in the universe, easily divisible into cycles within cycles. Where modern humans see past, present, and future, the Sumerians saw concentric rings, eras spiraling outward, all governed by the heavens. In this worldview, humanity didn't own time. Time belonged to the gods. Humans were merely participants in a divine schedule set long before their birth. When kingship shifted from Eridu to Kish, it wasn't politics. It was the next turn of a cosmic wheel. This perspective forces us to rethink those impossible numbers. Perhaps they weren't impossible at all. Perhaps they were simply measuring something else, something vast, cyclical, and deeply alien to how modern humanity perceives time. To the Sumerians, history wasn't just recorded. It was preordained in the stars. To modern historians, the numbers in the Sumerian King List appear extravagant. Reigns measured in tens of thousands of years seem like pure myth. But some researchers propose a different view, one that reframes these reigns not as lifespans, but as measurements of celestial time. This perspective is known as the cosmic clock theory, an idea that suggests the Sumerians encoded vast astronomical cycles within the structure of their king list. At the heart of this theory is the Sumerian use of the sexagesimal system, a base 60 numerical framework that perfectly accommodates divisions of time and space. Many of the reign lengths in the king list are multiples of 60, and even the total of 241,200 years divides evenly by sacred numbers in Sumerian cosmology. Rather than chronicling literal years, the list may be a star map in numerical form, charting shifts in celestial epochs. Consider this. The Sumerians were remarkably skilled observers of the night sky. Their temples and ziggurats were aligned with solstice points, star risings, and planetary cycles. Some reign lengths match multiples of what may correspond to precessional intervals, long astronomical cycles tied to the wobble of the Earth's axis, which modern science measures at roughly 25,920 years. While we cannot prove direct knowledge of precession, the precision of their numeric structure raises unsettling questions. In this cosmic clock model, each king's reign corresponds to a celestial segment, a turn of the heavens. Kingship wasn't just rule, it was a timestamp marking when divine authority was aligned with specific constellations or planetary configurations. The flood, in this view, may symbolize a great reset of that clock, dividing ages into before and after. If true, this means the King List is more than history. It's a cosmic calendar, a relic of an ancient worldview that saw humanity's destiny as synchronized with the stars themselves. To the Sumerians, the gods didn't just rule from above, they kept time. And kingship was simply the hand that moved on their celestial clock. Few topics in ancient history stir as much debate as the Anunnaki. In the quiet wedge-shaped lines of the Sumerian King List and other cuneiform texts, they are described as those who came from heavens. But what exactly that means has been fiercely contested for decades. Mainstream historians see the Anunnaki as mythological deities, divine figures representing natural forces, rulers, or cosmic order. Others, however, argue something far more controversial, that these sky beings might represent actual visitors, remembered in myth as gods. This alternative interpretation gained prominence in the 20th century when researchers began examining Sumerian texts through the lens of ancient astronaut theories. According to this view, the Anunnaki weren't just symbolic deities, but a powerful, advanced race who intervened in early human history. Proponents argue that many of the texts describe technologies and celestial knowledge that would have been far beyond the capabilities of early Bronze Age civilizations. To them, the phrase kingship descended from heaven isn't poetry, it's literal. Critics, of course, dismiss these claims as pseudo-history. They argue that ancient texts are layered with metaphor, ritual language, and theological symbolism that should not be taken at face value. But the controversy persists because the source material itself is ambiguous. The Sumerians spoke of gods walking among them, teaching them agriculture, astronomy, and laws. They described beings with specific names, roles, and even genealogies, not just vague spirits. This ambiguity fuels endless debate. Is it mythology reflecting early humanity's awe of the cosmos? Or is it a distorted memory of encounters long forgotten, encoded in clay? The Anunnaki question sits at the crossroads of scholarship and speculation, a mirror reflecting both human imagination and our hunger to understand where we came from. Whether gods, myths, or visitors, their presence in the oldest records of civilization remains one of history's most haunting enigmas. Among the most curious elements of Sumerian mythology is how the creation of humanity is described. In the ancient stories, the Anunnaki are said to have fashioned mankind from clay, mixing divine essence with earthly material. At first glance, this seems like poetic imagery, God shaping humans from mud. But to some scholars and alternative theorists, this language hides symbolic references to genetic engineering or biological manipulation, described in the only language ancient humans had at their disposal, myth. In several Sumerian creation texts, particularly the Enuma Elish and related myths, humanity is formed not as an accident but for a purpose, to bear the burdens of the gods. According to these stories, the Anunnaki were weary of labor and required a new species to maintain their cities, farms, and temples. The act of creation involves mixing the blood of a god with clay, a striking metaphor that some interpret as an ancient description of merging genetic material from two sources to create a new being. Even the language of breath of life and divine seed carries powerful biological undertones. Many cultures use these terms metaphorically, but the Sumerians were specific and structured in their accounts. They list steps, rituals, and key figures involved in the act of creation, like Enki, the god of wisdom, and Ninhursag, the mother goddess often associated with birthing the first humans. The stories even describe a womb of creation, a chamber or vessel where humans were formed. Mainstream historians see these as mythic metaphors for fertility and divine origin stories. But alternative interpretations suggest they may encode distant memories of advanced intervention, remembered through the language of clay, breath, and blood. Whether myth or memory, the precision and repetition of these narratives are striking. The Sumerians didn't describe humans simply appearing. They described them being made, step by step, in a process too deliberate to ignore. In the earliest Sumerian myths, humanity doesn't arrive as a chosen race destined to rule the earth. Instead, it emerges as a workforce, created with purpose, not freedom. In these texts, the Anunnaki are portrayed not only as creators but as masters, frustrated by the weight of their own labor on Earth. The story begins with the great gods toiling, digging canals, maintaining fields, and building sacred places. Eventually, they rebel against their own burdens, demanding a solution. That solution was humanity. The texts describe a council of gods where it is decided to create a new being, intelligent enough to follow orders, strong enough to work, and obedient enough to serve. In some versions, the blood of a slain god is mixed with clay to produce the first humans. The symbolism is profound. Humans were born not from accident or divine love, but from a calculated act of necessity. Unlike other mythologies that depict humans as children of gods, the Sumerian stories paint a more utilitarian picture. Man was created to bear the yoke. Names like Enki and Ninhursag appear repeatedly in these narratives as architects of this human experiment. They shape a being that can farm, build, and maintain temples so the Anunnaki may rest. It's a chilling perspective, one that frames early humanity not as rulers, but as workers under divine authority. This theme isn't unique to Sumer. Echoes of it can be found in other cultures, humans molded by gods to serve, to tend the earth, or to labor in divine fields. Whether these are metaphors for mankind's early struggles or fragments of a more mysterious past, they share one haunting message. We were made to serve something greater. To the Sumerians, this wasn't a shameful idea. It was cosmic order. The gods gave purpose, and humans fulfilled it. But in that story lies a quiet tension, one that would later shape myths of rebellion, freedom, and the quest to reclaim our own destiny. The idea of humans being created or shaped by higher beings isn't unique to Sumer. It echoes like a persistent drumbeat across ancient civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries. When we place the Sumerian stories of the Anunnaki beside other creation myths, patterns begin to emerge, patterns that hint at a shared narrative, or at the very least, a shared memory of something extraordinary. In Egypt, gods like Khnum were said to mold humans on a potter's wheel, shaping their bodies from clay and breathing life into them, an image strikingly similar to the Anunnaki mixing divine blood with earth. In Mesoamerica, the Maya gods attempted to create humans multiple times, crafting them from mud, then wood, and finally maize. In Greece, Prometheus shapes man from clay and steals fire from heaven to give him knowledge. Even the book of Genesis follows this same rhythm. Man formed from the dust of the earth, life breathed into him by a higher power, set to work in the garden. Across continents, these myths repeat key motifs: clay, divine essence, breath, creation, and servitude. One could argue these are simply archetypal stories, human attempts to explain existence with the materials and metaphors available. But others see something deeper, cultural fragments of a shared prehistoric event, retold through mythic language over millennia. If the Anunnaki narrative in Sumer was the earliest record, perhaps later civilizations inherited or reimagined this story through their own cultural lenses. The consistency is unsettling. Why do so many cultures describe humans as crafted, not evolved? Why the clay, the breath, the divine essence? Coincidence, shared psychology, or distant memory? Whatever the reason, the myth of human creation by those above has traveled across continents like an ancient whisper, one that refuses to be silenced. When one steps back from the fragmented myths, scattered texts, and whispered traditions, a single unsettling idea begins to take shape. What if these stories point to a deliberate ancient plan? The Anunnaki are described not as chaotic spirits, but as organized beings with purpose, arriving, building, creating, and ruling with structure. In the Sumerian King List and other cuneiform texts, their arrival is followed by order, the construction of cities, the descent of kingship, and the creation of humanity to serve. This suggests a sequence, not mythic chaos, but a planned timeline. First, the gods descend from heaven. Then they establish centers of power such as Eridu and Uruk. Then, when the burden of labor grows too great, humanity is created. The wording of these stories is remarkably systematic, describing councils, roles, and even disputes among the gods. more like a governing body than a pantheon of wandering deities. Some alternative interpretations propose that the creation of man was not a spontaneous miracle, but an engineered intervention, carried out for a purpose that has been diluted through millennia of myth. Humanity, in this view, was a designed species, born not to rule, but to build, tend, and sustain something greater. Even the catastrophic flood, the Great Reset, could be read not only as punishment, but as a controlled cleansing, a recalibration of an ongoing plan. Of course, mainstream historians interpret these stories symbolically as reflections of agricultural revolutions, class hierarchies, and early kingship. But the consistency across global myths raises haunting questions. Why the same structure? Why the same descent, the same act of creation, the same great flood, and the same divine withdrawal? If there truly was an ancient plan, whether divine, mythic, or something else entirely, its traces are buried not just in clay tablets, but in the foundations of human civilization itself. What began in Sumer may not have ended there. It may have been only the first chapter of a story humanity has yet to fully understand. For centuries, the study of Sumer has belonged largely to linguists, archaeologists, and historians. They work meticulously, reconstructing timelines, deciphering cuneiform, and tracing the development of early civilization. But when it comes to the Anunnaki and their supposed role in humanity's origins, the academic world draws a firm line. The majority of mainstream scholars reject any literal interpretation of these ancient stories, viewing them as mythology, nothing more, nothing less. This academic resistance isn't just intellectual disagreement, it's also cultural and institutional. Universities and research institutions have strict frameworks that separate mythology from acceptable history. The moment one suggests that the phrase kingship descended from heaven might be taken literally, or that the Sumerian King List encodes more than symbolic meaning, the conversation shifts from scholarship to the margins, into the realm of what some call forbidden history. There are reasons for this caution. The academic world relies on verifiable evidence, and texts alone, however mysterious, are not considered proof of extraterrestrial contact or hidden civilizations. Many skeptics argue that alternative theories rely too heavily on interpretive leaps, reading modern concepts, like genetic engineering or advanced technology, into symbolic ancient language. But there's also a quieter undercurrent, a fear of what happens if those boundaries blur. If myths are treated as potential records of lost knowledge, the entire structure of conventional chronology begins to wobble. The neat division between history and prehistory, between myth and fact, would become dangerously porous. This resistance has created two worlds. In one, Anunnaki are studied as poetic inventions. In the other, they're examined as possible actors in an ancient human drama. The two rarely meet. And yet, as more ancient sites are unearthed and new methods of analysis emerge, the pressure between these two perspectives grows. What was once fringe is now debated, sometimes behind closed doors, as the boundaries of what we consider acceptable history are quietly tested. As mainstream academia holds its line, a different movement has grown steadily in the shadows. A network of independent and fringe researchers who challenge the orthodox view of the Anunnaki and the origins of civilization. These are not traditional archaeologists bound by institutional frameworks, but journalists, engineers, linguists, rogue historians, and passionate enthusiasts. While their approaches often lack the rigor of established scholarship, their reach has become global, amplified by books, documentaries, podcasts, and online platforms. This rise began in the mid to late 20th century, when a handful of authors questioned the purely symbolic interpretation of texts like the Sumerian King List. They pointed to the mathematical precision, the detailed celestial references, and the recurring descriptions of gods descending from the sky as evidence worth investigating, not dismissing. Over time, their work ignited a movement that blurred the line between history and speculation. Unlike academic circles, fringe researchers are unrestricted by rigid peer review systems. This gives them the freedom to explore ideas mainstream scholars won't touch, but it also leaves their claims vulnerable to criticism and misinterpretation. Some approach the subject carefully, cross-referencing linguistic, astronomical, and archaeological data. Others dive into wilder territory, constructing elaborate narratives of alien intervention, hidden technologies, and suppressed truths. But what can't be denied is their influence. While universities may dismiss them, millions of people have encountered the Anunnaki not in scholarly journals but in documentaries, late-night interviews, and viral videos. Their storytelling often bridges ancient mystery with modern imagination, drawing an audience eager for explanations that the official narratives don't provide. This cultural shift has forced even some cautious academics to acknowledge the public fascination with forbidden history. What began as a fringe whisper has grown into a parallel discourse, one that doesn't seek permission to ask uncomfortable questions. Whether their theories hold truth or not, these researchers have changed the landscape of the debate, ensuring that the story of the Anunnaki is no longer confined to dusty tablets, but alive in the modern mind. Amid theories, debates, and bold interpretations, one crucial fact often gets lost. The original Sumerian texts themselves are remarkably specific. Stripped of modern speculation, they offer a direct glimpse into how the Anunnaki were perceived by the people who carved their stories into clay thousands of years ago. To understand the debate fully, it is essential to return to the source, the cuneiform tablets. The texts describe the Anunnaki as a group of powerful beings, often associated with the heavens and the underworld. They are not vague figures but named entities, like Enki, Enlil, Ninhursag, and Anu, each with defined roles in cosmic and earthly affairs. In the Sumerian King List, they are linked directly to the concept of kingship, which descended from heaven to specific cities, establishing divine rule on earth. The texts also outline sequences of events rather than vague myths: descent from heaven, founding of cities like Eridu, the reign of 8 kings, the Great Flood, and then the resumption of kingship. In creation stories, they speak of humans being formed to relieve the gods of labor, mixing divine blood with clay, not a metaphor to the Sumerians but a cosmic act witnessed and recorded as fact in their worldview. Importantly, these texts make no explicit mention of extraterrestrials, spacecraft, or modern technology. Those are later interpretations layered over ancient language. What they do reveal, however, is a deeply structured belief system in which the gods were active participants in human destiny, walking among people, granting power, and shaping civilization. It's this blurry line between myth and event that fuels both mainstream caution and fringe enthusiasm. The tablets don't provide proof of alien architects, but they also don't fit neatly into the category of mere fable. They stand as testimonies of a worldview that believed in a real, tangible connection between heaven and earth, a connection that, according to the Sumerians, began long before written history as we know it. When studying the Anunnaki and their role in the earliest stories of humanity, it's important to remember this. Our understanding is incomplete. The surviving Sumerian King List and related cuneiform tablets represent only a fraction of what once existed. Time, war, looting, erosion, and the fragility of clay have ensured that much of the original record has been lost forever. What we read today are fragments of a far larger, more complex narrative. Archaeologists and philologists often work with shattered tablets, piecing together lines like a puzzle. Many contain gaps, missing words, eroded symbols, or entire sections obliterated by centuries of damage. Key events, names, or descriptions are sometimes only inferred from partial lines or later copies. For example, some early lists of kings are broken at crucial moments, just before or after references to the descent of kingship or the Great Flood, leaving researchers with frustrating blanks where answers might have once been. Even more elusive are the untranslated or undiscovered texts. Thousands of tablets remain in archives around the world, cataloged but not yet fully studied. Others are held in private collections or remain buried beneath the sands of Iraq, where ancient cities like Eridu, Ur, and Uruk still lie partially unexplored. Every missing fragment could alter the story, clarify myths, challenge assumptions, or unveil forgotten details about the gods, their actions, and humanity's role. This missing context is what fuels so much speculation. Fringe researchers see these gaps as evidence of deliberately hidden knowledge. Scholars see them as unfortunate losses of history. But both agree on one thing. We are looking at an incomplete puzzle. The Anunnaki story we know may only be the outline of a deeper narrative, one whose full shape remains buried in the dust. And until those missing pieces are found, every interpretation, whether mainstream or alternative, is built on shadows and silence as much as on stone and clay. Between the rigid lines of mainstream academia and the daring leaps of alternative theory lies a narrow, shadowed space, a place where the fragments of the past whisper quietly, waiting to be heard. The story of the Anunnaki exists in this in-between. It is not entirely myth, nor fully proven history. It lives in what is missing, in the cracks of time that neither camp can fully claim. What we know comes from surviving cuneiform, fractured, incomplete, sometimes contradictory. The Sumerian King List, myths of creation, flood narratives, and hymns reveal a worldview where the heavens and earth were not separate realms. Gods walked among men, kingship descended from the sky, and humanity was given a role in a vast cosmic drama. But for every line that survives, there are many more that have been lost, washed away by war, erosion, and the silence of millennia. This uncertainty is where debates thrive. Academics cling to caution and evidence, guarding against unfounded conclusions. Fringe researchers dive into the gaps, searching for meaning where none is explicitly written. Both, in their own ways, are reacting to the same thing, an incomplete history that refuses to give up all its secrets. Perhaps the truth isn't wholly in the tablets or in wild theories, but in the spaces between them. The Sumerians lived in a world closer to the dawn of civilization than we can fully imagine. Their understanding of gods, stars, and humanity was forged in that early, unrecorded darkness. And it is in that darkness, between a line of text and a missing fragment, between myth and memory, that the most enduring mysteries linger. The Anunnaki may be history, myth, or both, but the truth endures quietly in the cracks of time where the past still breathes. History has a strange way of repeating itself, though never in quite the same form. The echoes of the earliest civilizations, especially those of Sumer and the mythic rule of the Anunnaki, seem to ripple through time like distant thunder. While the world today looks nothing like the ancient cities of Eridu or Uruk, the patterns of power they established remain hauntingly familiar. In the Sumerian King List, kingship does not belong to mortals. It descends from heaven, moves from city to city, and transfers power like a torch passed down through ages. If we strip away the mythic language, what remains is a cycle of rise and fall. Great powers ascend, rule, then collapse, only for a new center to emerge and claim the throne of the world. This pattern can be traced forward through the rise and fall of Babylon, Rome, Byzantium, London, and beyond. Modern empires may not invoke gods to legitimize their rule, but they still lean on symbols of higher authority, divine right, manifest destiny, or technological supremacy. Ancient kings claimed descent from the heavens. Modern leaders claim destiny, exceptionalism, or ideological purity. The language changes, but the structure remains. Some researchers argue this repetition isn't accidental. It mirrors the ancient template of power laid down thousands of years ago, a kind of cultural inheritance consciously or unconsciously passed down through myth, ritual, and political systems. Like the shifting of kingship from one Sumerian city to another, world power seems to flow along invisible lines, as if guided by a rhythm humanity itself barely understands. Perhaps this is why the myths of the Anunnaki still captivate modern minds. They don't just speak of the past. They reflect the shape of power itself, a shape that has repeated across millennia, from clay tablets to glass towers. In the cycles of history, the throne never truly disappears. It only waits for its next ruler. Throughout history, ruling bloodlines have often claimed something extraordinary about their origins. From the divine emperors of China to the god kings of Egypt, from medieval monarchs of Europe to modern royal families, there's a common thread: the belief in sacred blood. This idea isn't new. It echoes directly from the myths of the Anunnaki, where power was said to be granted by heavenly descent and maintained through carefully preserved divine lineages. In the Sumerian King List, rulers were not chosen by democratic vote or mere conquest. Kingship descended from heaven and resided with specific figures who were believed to hold divine legitimacy. This spiritual inheritance mirrors later myths, such as the divine right of kings in Europe, where rulers claimed their authority was given not by people, but by God. Pharaohs were considered gods themselves, their bloodlines a direct link to the divine. In some traditions, even modern dynasties whisper of ancient origins, weaving legends that elevate their families above the common. Fringe researchers take this further, suggesting that such myths may have been echoes of an actual ancient system, where ruling classes preserve symbolic or real connections to a group perceived as from heavens. Whether one interprets the Anunnaki as deities, extraterrestrial visitors, or purely mythic figures, the concept of chosen bloodlines persisted like a seed carried through millennia. This fascination with lineage isn't just ceremonial. It's also a tool of control. When rulers claim divine ancestry, their power becomes unquestionable, their authority sacred. Myths of holy bloodlines shape nations, wars, and entire civilizations. Even today, in a supposedly rational and scientific age, whispers of elite bloodlines, ancient families, and hidden legacies still circulate in conspiratorial corners of the world. Whether fact or fiction, these narratives trace their roots to Sumer's first kings, and to the timeless belief that power is not earned, but inherited from the sky. In every era, there are those who look backward, not out of curiosity, but out of yearning. Hidden beneath politics, religion, and even science lies a deep human obsession with the idea of ancient legacies. From powerful leaders to secret societies, from academic circles to fringe researchers, many have attempted to trace modern power back to the earliest civilizations, and few names ignite that obsession quite like the Anunnaki. The Sumerian King List stands at the center of this fixation. If kingship truly descended from heaven and transferred from city to city like a torch of divine authority, then someone somewhere may have tried to keep that flame alive long after the tablets crumbled. For centuries, rulers across continents have adopted symbols, rituals, and myths that mirror ancient Sumerian imagery: winged deities, celestial crowns, serpentine motifs, and star alignments woven into their architecture. This is no coincidence. Across history, empires have sought to legitimize their rule by tying themselves to something older, something that feels eternal. Pharaohs traced their lineage to gods. Roman emperors claimed descent from heroes. European monarchies adopted biblical and mythological genealogies. Even today, some secretive groups and political movements weave whispers of Sumer, Atlantis, or lost star-born civilizations into their mythos. Why? Because linking power to an ancient, almost divine source creates an aura that mere politics cannot. It transforms authority into destiny. It suggests that a ruler, bloodline, or an institution is not just another chapter in history, but a continuation of something primordial. This obsession isn't limited to elites. Popular culture is steeped in it. Books, films, and digital conspiracies feed the idea that ancient legacies still shape modern power structures. Whether true or not, the hunger to believe that our present is connected to a forgotten golden age remains powerful. At the root of many of these beliefs, buried beneath centuries of retelling, lies the ancient shadow of the Anunnaki, the first Sky Kings, whose imagined legacy still haunts the corridors of modern power. Whispers of secret societies guarding ancient wisdom have echoed through history like faint but persistent drumbeats. Whether it's the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, or whispered myths about hidden councils behind empires, there is a recurring belief that some small, powerful groups hold fragments of forgotten knowledge that may trace its origins back to the earliest civilizations and perhaps even to the Anunnaki themselves. Throughout time, symbols associated with these groups have mirrored ancient Sumerian imagery: winged discs, star alignments, serpent motifs, and stepped structures reminiscent of ziggurats. Whether these connections are coincidental, inherited cultural patterns, or deliberate references is still debated. Yet one fact remains: the myth of old knowledge, wisdom passed down from a time before the Great Flood, is woven deeply into the stories these societies tell about themselves. In some interpretations, these secret groups believe they are the keepers of a legacy that began when kingship descended from heaven. They claim to preserve fragments of lost science, star maps, and sacred texts, ideas that mirror the language of the Sumerian King List and other cuneiform sources. Historians, of course, often see these claims as symbolic or fabricated. But the persistence of these narratives across centuries is telling. Even modern political and financial elites have been accused, fairly or not, of invoking ancient myths to legitimize their power, creating a narrative of destiny rather than mere opportunity. Fringe researchers argue that secret societies operate like echoes of the first priest kings, guarding knowledge not meant for the masses. Skeptics, on the other hand, see these stories as modern myth-making, designed to give ordinary power structures an aura of mystique. Whatever the truth may be, the idea that a hidden thread connects the Anunnaki era to modern power centers is a myth that refuses to fade. Whether as fact, fiction, or carefully curated legend, it ensures that the old knowledge of forgotten gods continues to cast long shadows into the present. Long after the first kings of Sumer faded into dust, their echoes remained, not in their bones or crowns, but in the structures, symbols, and systems they left behind. These remnants are the invisible scaffolding beneath much of human civilization. Though millennia have passed since the names of the Anunnaki were spoken in reverence, their legacy, real or imagined, is embedded like fossils in the foundation of history. The Sumerian King List doesn't just record names. It encodes a model of power, how authority is bestowed, how it moves, how it survives calamity. This idea of kingship, descending from heaven, created an enduring template. Power is not born from the people, but granted from above, a sacred flame that can be transferred but not questioned. Centuries later, this very concept resurfaced in divine right monarchies, priestly classes, and imperial cults around the world. But the kings left more than ideas. Architectural alignments found in temple complexes, mathematical systems that underpinned early calendars, and celestial symbolism etched into monuments suggest a worldview built on a connection between heaven and earth. Modern structures of governance, religion, and even commerce can trace their roots, however faintly, to these early frameworks. The shadow of Eridu, the first city, stretches far. More elusive, however, is what they may have left unwritten. The missing tablets, the destroyed libraries, the gaps between stories that still drive modern theorists to search for an original source, something the priest kings may have guarded fiercely. Whether one views the Anunnaki as myth or something more, their symbolic inheritance is undeniable. Modern rulers still use ancient imagery, society still tells stories of god-kings, and humanity still looks to the sky for answers. What the kings left behind is not just stone and script. It is a pattern, a blueprint of power, and a question that has never fully gone silent. The number is staggering, 241,200 years. It stands carved into the Sumerian King List like a quiet act of rebellion against everything modern history tells us. According to these ancient records, 8 kings ruled for this incomprehensible span of time before the Great Flood changed everything. For centuries, scholars have dismissed this figure as myth or symbolic exaggeration. And yet, the number refuses to fade away. Each time researchers return to the King List, they are confronted with a timeline that defies conventional history. Humanity, as we are taught, did not have organized civilization 241,000 years ago. Yet here, on weathered clay tablets from Sumer, is carefully structured chronology, with names, cities, and reign lengths precisely recorded. Even if read metaphorically, why would the Sumerians choose such specific numbers in such immense spans? This is where the debate deepens. Fringe theorists claim this timeline points to a pre-Diluvian age, an era when the Anunnaki ruled directly, shaping early humanity long before recorded history began. Some suggest the reigns were measured in a different scale of time, perhaps in divine years, where the span represents cycles of astronomical or cosmic significance rather than literal human lifespans. Others view the figure as a symbolic marker, hinting at the presence of a lost chapter in human origins. Mainstream historians argue for a simpler explanation, that the long reigns reflect a mythological glorification of rulers, a way to link kings to the eternal. But even in that view, something remains intriguing. Why such precision? Why record myth as math? No matter which interpretation one leans toward, 241,200 years remains a riddle, a whisper from deep antiquity that challenges the neat boundaries of accepted timelines. It is a number too vast to ignore, a number that suggests humanity's story may stretch further than we dare to imagine. The story of the Anunnaki and the 241,200-year reign is more than just a fragment of myth. It has become an unbroken thread, weaving its way from the clay of ancient Sumer to the glowing screens of the modern world. Unlike many ancient legends that faded into the mists of time, this one refuses to die. It is whispered, reinterpreted, challenged, and revived in every era. Part of this persistence lies in how the story never fully closed. The Sumerian King List does not tell us where the first kings came from, only that kingship descended from heaven. It does not explain why their reigns lasted for millennia, only that they did. It does not clarify the nature of these figures, only that they ruled before the flood. These deliberate silences create a space for wonder, a void into which each generation pours its own questions. The thread weaves through religious text, esoteric teachings, and scientific speculation. Echoes of the flood appear in countless cultures. Myths of gods walking among humans are told on every continent, and in each retelling, the shape of the mystery remains familiar, like a story humanity can't stop repeating. Skeptics see this endurance as a testament to myth's power, an archetype of rulers and gods that speaks to the human psyche. Fringe theorists see it as evidence of a real, hidden legacy that survived across civilizations. Neither side can fully unravel the knot, because the King List isn't just a record. It's a doorway, a place where myth, history, and possibility intersect. In the cracks of broken tablets and the rhythm of oral traditions, this thread winds tighter. It is a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to vanish. They live on not because they are fully known, but because they refuse to be forgotten. When ancient texts speak of gods who will return, of cycles that will repeat, and of kingship that will once again descend from heaven, one can't help but ask, are these prophecies or memories? The language of the Sumerian King List doesn't just look backward, it looks forward. This dual gaze is part of why the Anunnaki legend has endured for thousands of years. It doesn't simply describe a past age, it hints at a return. In Sumerian myth, time was not linear, but cyclical. Ages rose and fell like tides. Kingship moved from city to city, and the gods walked the earth in one era, only to vanish in another. Many researchers and storytellers interpret this cyclical narrative as a kind of prophetic framework, suggesting that what happened once may happen again. But what if these aren't prophecies in the modern sense at all? What if they are echoes of cultural memory? Stories meant to preserve the memory of something extraordinary that occurred in humanity's distant, fog-shrouded past. Across civilizations, we find eerily similar motifs. Gods promising to return, golden ages that will rise again, stars that will align as they once did. From Sumer to Egypt, from Mesoamerican codices to biblical prophecies, the theme repeats like a drumbeat across time. Skeptics view this as human storytelling, shaped by hopes and fears of cosmic cycles and divine intervention. But for others, these repeated patterns feel less like collective invention and more like whispers from an older reality, fragments of memory passed down in mythic language. Whether prophecy or memory, the effect is the same. It keeps the legend alive. Every retelling, every translation, every theory is another thread added to an ever-growing tapestry. And in that tapestry, the Anunnaki are not just figures of the past. They are waiting in the future. We live in an age of satellites, artificial intelligence, and space probes. Yet the oldest questions humanity ever asked still linger in the corners of modern thought. Who are we? Where did we come from? Are we alone? And perhaps most haunting of all, have we been visited before? These are not new questions. They echo the same wonder and unease, that shaped the myths of Sumer thousands of years ago. The Anunnaki may have emerged from clay tablets, but their shadow stretches into the 21st century. When people look to the stars today, equipped with telescopes and data rather than omens and ziggurats, they are still asking the same questions the ancient Sumerians wrapped in myth. Back then, kingship descended from heaven. Now, scientists search for habitable planets and trace cosmic signals, as if waiting for something to speak back. The language has changed, but the yearning has not. Part of what keeps the Anunnaki story alive is how unnervingly modern it feels. Advanced beings arriving from the sky, shaping civilization, then disappearing. It sounds less like a dusty legend and more like a science fiction script. But fiction and myth have always been mirrors of human longing. When we dig into these stories, we are really digging into ourselves, into the human need to connect the dots between earth and sky. For skeptics, these tales are cultural artifacts. For believers, they are encoded truths waiting to be rediscovered. But for everyone, they pose the same irresistible puzzle. If we are not the first chapter of this story, how much have we forgotten? Modern man stands with satellites in orbit, but his gaze fixed on the same stars the Sumerians once worshipped. The questions remain unchanged. Only the tools have evolved. And perhaps, somewhere in those questions, the real legacy of the Anunnaki survives. Myths are often treated as mirrors, reflections of the people who created them. But some stories have a strange way of staring back, as if they're not just tales we tell, but messages left behind. The legend of the Anunnaki and the staggering 241,200-year reign carved into the Sumerian King List feels like one of those myths. It doesn't just whisper of the past. It watches us in the present, daring us to confront the gaps in our understanding of history. For centuries, humans have looked into the past trying to explain it away. Mythology becomes symbolism. Gods become metaphors. Timelines are folded neatly into accepted narratives. Yet some stories resist being tamed. They refuse to be filed away as allegory. They linger, demanding not belief but engagement. The Anunnaki legend is one of those stories, not because it offers proof, but because it raises questions no one can fully silence. Perhaps that's why it feels, at times, as though the myth itself is looking back, not accusing, not confirming, but reminding. Reminding us that history is written not only in books and tablets, but also in what has been lost, erased, or deliberately hidden. That some narratives are too old, too vast, to be easily contained by modern certainty. Skeptics see mythology as a canvas onto which humanity projects its fears and hopes. Believers see encoded truths, but both stand before the same enigma, a myth that has survived empires, religions, and ages of reason, still whispering across millennia. When myths look back at us, they reflect not what they were, but who we are. Our hunger for origins, our discomfort with the unknown, our instinct to look to the stars and wonder. Perhaps the power of the Anunnaki story isn't that it proves something, but that it won't let us look away. What began as a simple clay tablet ends as a mirror held up to our understanding of history. The Sumerian King List does not simply record, it remembers. It remembers names that echo through impossible years. It remembers gods that walked like kings and kings who reigned like gods. It remembers a world before the world we know. Whether myth, coded astronomy, or forbidden history, one truth lingers. Some stories refuse to die. They endure through flood, fire, and empire. If this journey through hidden time has stirred your curiosity, give this video a like and subscribe to Whispered Empires to keep exploring the shadows of history with me. And now, I'll leave the mystery to you. Do you believe the Sumerian King List is history or legend hiding a forgotten truth? Your thoughts just might be the next whisper we follow.